Hey guys, and welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, settle in, and let your shoulders drop. Tonight, we're not going to wade through the murky gene pool of some forgotten Habsburg duke or another. Instead, we're going to float back in time, all the way back to ancient Egypt. But not the Egypt of golden sarcophagi and pyramid-building pharaohs you might be picturing. We're heading to a newer, shinier Egypt, a place built on Greek ambition and a truly obsessive, almost pathological, need to own every book ever written. So get comfortable, and let's drift back to a city born from the mind of a conqueror and a dream of containing all the knowledge in the world under one roof. We're talking, of course, about the Library of Alexandria, a place that has become a symbol for lost knowledge, for cultural erasure, and for the heartbreaking fragility of human genius. But its story isn't just about a great fire and a tragic loss. It's a much slower, stranger, and more human story than that. It's a story of ego, rivalry, royal dysfunction, and a very, very long and gradual decline into obscurity. Our story begins, as so many do in this era, with Alexander the Great. In 332 BC, he swept into Egypt, kicked out the Persians, and was hailed as a liberator. While there, he found a nice little strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Mar. It had good access to the Nile, a great spot for a port, and a nice coastal breeze. Here, he decided he would build his new capital, a city to bear his name for eternity. But Alexander, being Alexander, didn't stick around to see it built. He had more of the world to conquer, more battles to win, and an appointment with destiny in Babylon, where he would die in his early 30s, leaving his massive empire to be carved up by his generals. This is where our first major player enters the scene. Ptolemy VIII. Ptolemy was one of Alexander's most trusted companions, a shrewd, cautious, and incredibly clever Macedonian general. While the other generals were fighting bloody wars over the heartland of the empire, Ptolemy made a beeline for the richest, most stable, and most defensible province of them all, Egypt. He saw it as the ultimate prize, a land of ancient wealth and history that he could rule as his own personal kingdom. To legitimize his rule, he did something both brilliant and deeply weird. He hijacked Alexander the Great's funeral procession. Alexander's body was supposed to be taken back to Macedonia for burial, but Ptolemy intercepted the sarcophagus and brought it to Egypt. He first buried it in Memphis, the old capital, and later moved it to a grand mausoleum in Alexandria. It was the ultimate power move. He couldn't be Alexander, but he could be the guy who owned Alexander's body. It turned Alexandria into an instant tourist destination and a site of pilgrimage, cementing his claim as the true successor to the great conqueror. With his power base secure and the grain wealth of Egypt filling his coffers, Ptolemy I began to think about legacy. He wanted Alexandria to be more than just a rich port city. He wanted it to be the new Athens, the undisputed cultural and intellectual capital of the entire Hellenistic world. And to that you needed more than just a dead celebrity in a tomb. You needed scholars. You needed poets. And most of all, you needed books. Enter our second key figure, Demetrius. Demetrius was an Athenian orator, a statesman, and a philosopher who had once ruled Athens. But, as is often the case with politicians, he was eventually forced into exile. He found refuge at Ptolemy's court in Alexandria around 295 BC. Demetrius was a man of immense learning and grand ideas. He saw what Ptolemy was trying to do and gave him the blueprint. He reportedly told the king that what he needed was a universal library, a place that would collect a copy of every single book in the known world. This idea was completely revolutionary. Before this, libraries were mostly small, private collections held by wealthy individuals or attached to temples. The idea of a state-funded institution with the explicit goal of acquiring everything ever written was unheard of. It was an undertaking of breathtaking ambition. Ptolemy, a man who loved grand projects that shouted his importance from the rooftops, was immediately sold. So, they established the Mauseon, or Institution of the Muses. This wasn't just a library, it was a full-blown research university. It had lecture halls, laboratories, observatories, botanical gardens, a zoo, and living quarters for a community of full-time, state-sponsored scholars. These scholars were given generous salaries, tax exemptions, and free food and lodging. Their only job was to think, to research, to write, and to argue. It was basically a permanent, government-funded academic retreat. The library itself was the centerpiece of the Mausian, the beating heart of this intellectual paradise. The mission was simple and utterly insane. Collect the world. Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who succeeded his father, became even more obsessed with this project. He poured unimaginable sums of money into the library. He sent agents across the Mediterranean to buy up any scrolls they could find in any language. He was ruthless. According to one account, any ship that docked in Alexandria's harbor was to be searched, not for contraband, but for books. Any scrolls found were seized and taken to the library to be copied by official scribes. Once copied, a brand new copy was given back to the original owner, and the library kept the original. It's a bit like having your phone confiscated at the airport, only for them to hand you back a cheap knockoff while they keep your original to add to a government database. A little rude, but undeniably effective. This policy had a legendary, if possibly apocryphal, outcome involving Athens. The Athenians owned the official state copies of the great tragedies by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These were precious cultural artifacts. Ptolemy II asked to borrow them for copying, and the Athenians, being understandably nervous, demanded a massive security deposit, 15 talents of silver, a truly astronomical sum. Ptolemy paid it without blinking. He then had the scrolls copied onto the highest quality papyrus using the best scribes, and then he kept the originals and sent the copies back to Athens, forfeiting his entire deposit. He basically told the city of Athens, "Thanks for the loan. The silver was for the trouble of losing your heritage." It was the ultimate flex, a clear message that Alexandria, not Athens, was now the center of the world. The Ptolemies didn't just collect Greek texts, they wanted everything. The most famous story is about the Septuagint, the first Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. The story goes that Ptolemy II invited Jewish scholars, Sikhs, from each of the 12 tribes of Israel to come to Alexandria to translate the Torah. They were housed on the island of Pharos, and in 72 days they each produced an identical Greek translation. It's a beautiful story of miraculous consensus, though modern scholars think it was probably a more collaborative and less magical process done by Alexandrian Jews for their own community. But the legend served its purpose. It showed that even the sacred texts of other cultures were being brought into the orbit of Alexandria, translated, and absorbed into its universal collection. The result of all this frantic, obsessive collecting was a library of a scale the world had never seen. Estimates of its size vary wildly, from 40,000 to 400,000 scrolls. It's hard for us to grasp what that means. A scroll wasn't a book in our sense. A single work like Homer's Iliad might take up 24 scrolls. But even with that caveat, the collection was immense. It was a chaotic, sprawling mass of papyrus, and with that scale came a whole new set of problems. How do you organize it? How do you find anything? How do you even know what you have? This is where the real genius of the library's scholars came into play. The first great librarian, Zenodotus of Ephesus, began the monumental task of creating a system. He organized the scrolls alphabetically by author. This might sound obvious to us, but it was a groundbreaking innovation at the time. He also began the work of critical editing, comparing different versions of the same text, like the many different copies of Homer that had been collected, to try and figure out which one was the most authentic. He would mark lines he thought were later additions or corruptions, beginning the entire field of literary criticism. But it was his successor, Callimachus of Cyrene, who truly created the map to this world of knowledge. Callimachus was a poet and a scholar, but he was not, funnily enough, the head librarian. That post went to another scholar. But Callimachus was the one who undertook the library's most important intellectual project. He created the Pinax, or tables. This was a 120-volume catalog of the entire library. It was the first library catalog in history. The Pinax listed authors alphabetically, provided a short biography for each one, and then listed all of their known works with the first line of each text to help distinguish them. It was a bibliography, a biographical dictionary, and a literary encyclopedia, all rolled into one. It didn't just catalog what the library owned. It attempted to catalog all of Greek literature. It created the very concept of a literary canon, defining what was important and what wasn't. It was an intellectual achievement arguably greater than the collection of the scrolls themselves. It imposed order on the chaos and turned a warehouse of papyrus into a functioning, navigable universe of thought. For about a century, this was the Golden Age. The greatest minds of the Hellenistic world flocked to Alexandria. Eratosthenes, the head librarian, calculated the circumference of the earth with astonishing accuracy using a stick, a well, and some basic geometry. Euclid wrote his Elements of Geometry, the foundational text for mathematics for the next 2 millennia. Archimedes, the brilliant inventor, likely studied here and corresponded with the scholars in Alexandria. Hero of Alexandria built early steam engines and automatons. Doctors like Erophilos and Erosistratus performed the first scientific dissections of human bodies, discovering the nervous system and the difference between motor and sensory nerves. It was a place of staggering intellectual ferment, but this paradise of the mind was built on a very shaky foundation: the whims of a single, increasingly dysfunctional royal family. The Ptolemies were not known for their stability. They were a dynasty prone to sibling marriage, paranoia, and bloody internal power struggles. And as the family went, so went their pet project, the library. The serene, scholarly world of the Mausian was never truly separate from the decadent and dangerous world of the royal court. And soon, the patronage that had created this intellectual Eden would begin to curdle, starting a long, slow process of decay that would eventually lead to its quiet, unremarkable end. But that, of course, is a story for later. For now, the dream was still very much alive. So we left off in our cozy, climate-controlled bubble of intellectual bliss. The library is thriving, the scholars are sciencing away, and everything seems to be going just swimmingly. But the Mausian, for all its him-ended pursuits, had a landlord. And that landlord was the Ptolemaic dynasty, a family that was quickly turning into the living embodiment of a tragicomic soap opera, complete with Sibyl spouses, murder plots, and a frankly alarming amount of drama. The patronage that was a nice, steady stream of funding under the first couple of Ptolemies was about to become a firehose of crazy, pointed directly at the heart of their grandfather's greatest project. The shift began subtly. After the book-obsessed Ptolemy II and his successor Ptolemy III, we get Ptolemy IV. Philip, his name means father-loving, which is usually a red flag in these families. He was less interested in the life of the mind and more interested in the life of luxury. He was a man of extravagant tastes, prone to throwing lavish religious festivals and building ridiculously large pleasure boats. One of his ships was a 420-foot catamaran, with multiple decks, banquet halls, and its own temple. It was essentially a floating palace that was so big it could barely be rowed out of the harbor. A perfect metaphor for his reign. Really. Impressive, expensive, and ultimately useless. While he was busy cosplaying as the god Dionysus, the actual running of the kingdom fell to his corrupt ministers. Cracks started to appear in the Egyptian edifice. For the first time, major revolts by native Egyptians broke out in the countryside, challenging Ptolemaic rule and, more importantly, draining the royal treasury. War and rebellion are expensive, and when a king has to choose between funding an army or funding a scholar to write a treatise on Homeric verb forms, the scholar usually loses. The unconditional blank check the library had enjoyed was starting to look a lot more conditional. But the real disaster, the man who would take a sledgehammer to the foundations of the Mausi, was Ptolemy VIII Euergetes II. And he is a character. History has given him the delightful nickname Phaiskin, meaning potbelly or bladder, because he was apparently grotesquely overweight. He wasn't just physically repellent, he was a moral monster. A paranoid, cruel, and vengeful tyrant who clawed his way to power through a tangle of incest and civil war that would make even the most hardened TV drama writer blush. Let's try to untangle this, shall we? Phaiskin initially caroled with his older brother, Ptolemy VI, and their sister, Cleopatra II. Yes, their sister, whom the older brother was married to. Keeping it in the family was just how the Ptolemies rolled. After a series of fallings out, invasions, and general chaos. The older brother died. So what does Phaiskin do? He marches back to Alexandria, seizes the throne, and, to consolidate his power, marries his newly widowed sister, Cleopatra II. But, because why not double down on the familial weirdness, he then also seduces and marries her daughter, his own niece, who was, of course, also named Cleopatra III. So now he's married to both a mother and her daughter at the same time, playing them off against each other while Alexandria descended into civil war. It was messy. Now, what does any of this royal dysfunction have to do with our quiet little library? Everything. The scholars and intellectuals of the Mausian were seen as part of the Alexandrian elite, a group that had generally sided with Phaiskin's brother and his sister wife during the Civil War. When Phaiskin finally gained the upper hand, he was in no mood for forgiveness. He saw the Mausian not as a national treasure, but as a nest of his political enemies. And so he initiated a brutal purge. This wasn't a single, fiery event. It was a cold, systematic, and terrifying campaign of persecution. Scholars were arrested. Some were executed. Many more were simply exiled, stripped of their positions and stipends, and forced to flee Egypt for their lives. Imagine being a celebrated grammarian, perhaps the world's leading expert on Sapphic poetry, who had spent the last 30 years in the sun-drenched courtyards of the Mausian with a guaranteed salary and endless Then, one day, a decree comes from the Bewitched King, and you're on a boat with nothing but the clothes on your back, heading for some backwater island in the Aegean. This act of petty, paranoid vengeance caused a catastrophic brain drain. The intellectual light of the world, which the first Ptolemies had so carefully concentrated in Alexandria, was suddenly scattered to the winds. A contemporary observer wrote, with a thick layer of sarcasm, that Phaiskin deserved thanks from the world. Because he had filled the islands and towns with philosophers, geometers, musicians, painters, and other masters who, being poor and exiled from their country, taught for a living what they knew. In his effort to punish his enemies, Phaiskin had accidentally reseeded the entire Mediterranean with Greek learning. Small comfort for the scholars, I'm sure, but a darkly ironic twist. The head librarian himself, a man named Aristarchus of Samothrace, one of the greatest critical scholars of antiquity, who had standardized the texts of Homer, saw the writing on the wall and fled to Cyprus, where he died shortly after. Phaiskin replaced him, not with another world-class academic, but with a military crony, a guy named Sidus, who was an officer from his guard. The message was clear. Loyalty to the king now mattered more than intellectual merit. The Mausian was no longer an independent haven for geniuses. It was just another department of the state, subject to the whims of its unstable master. This was a turning point. The first great wound to the library wasn't a fire. It was a purge. It broke the institutional continuity. It replaced the culture of open inquiry with one of fear. And it changed the library's function. New scholars were eventually brought in, of course, but the institution became more focused on teaching and preserving what was already known, rather than on groundbreaking new research. The golden age of discovery was over. The great Mainster Eratosthenes and the Euclids were gone. The library was still huge, it was still prestigious, but its creative soul had been grievously wounded. It had become a magnificent, oversized museum, rather than a living laboratory. From this point on, the fate of the library is tied directly to the decline of Ptolemaic Egypt itself. The kingdom was crumbling from within, plagued by revolts and increasingly overshadowed by a new, terrifying power rising in the west, Rome. The Romans were practical, militaristic, and had little time for the abstract intellectual games of the Greeks. Their growing influence would bring a new kind of trouble to Alexandria, one that involved soldiers, sieges, and a man who had a fateful encounter with a certain Egyptian queen. And that, of course, is where things get even more complicated. But we'll let that float for a bit, and pick it up again later. Alright, so we've established that our beloved library has already taken a serious hit. Not from a fire, but from a fat, paranoid king with a grudge. The best and brightest have been scattered, and the institution has shifted from a vibrant research hub to more of a prestigious, but slightly dusty, archive. The creative spark is gone, replaced by a quiet hum of preservation. And all the while, The Ptolemaic dynasty continues its slow, spiraling descent into chaos, looking less like a line of divine pharaohs and more like a family that desperately needs a therapist. And as Egypt weakened, Rome was watching. The Romans, everly opportunists, loved a good dysfunctional family they could manipulate. They became the unofficial referees in the ongoing Ptolemaic sibling rivalries. Whenever one royal sibling tried to murder another, they'd both send envoys to Rome, bribing senators and begging for support. Rome was more than happy to play along, lending money, choosing sides, and slowly wrapping its tentacles around the ancient kingdom of the Nile. By the mid-1st century BC, Egypt was basically a Roman client state, a rich but broken kingdom, living on borrowed time and borrowed money. This brings us to the final and most famous generation of Ptolemy's Cleopatra VII and her younger brother/husband, Ptolemy XIII. Yes, they were married. He was about 10 years old. She was a teenager. And they were quarrelers who absolutely hated each other. Their father had willed the kingdom to both of them, and in a fantastically naive move, had named the Roman Republic as the executor of his will, basically inviting them to come meddle. Naturally, the court split into factions. The advisors to the boy king Ptolemy XIII, seeing an opportunity to rule through a puppet, drove Cleopatra out of Alexandria. She fled to the eastern provinces, raised her own army, and prepared to march back and claim her throne. A full-blown civil war was brewing, and it's right into this tinderbox that the most powerful man in the world decided to drop in for a visit. Enter Gaius Julius Caesar. In 48 BC, Caesar arrives in Alexandria, but he's not there for a library cards. He's fresh from his victory at the Battle of Pharsalus, where he had crushed the forces of his great rival, Pompey the Great. He was chasing Pompey across the Mediterranean, and his pursuit led him to Egypt. But he was a day late. The court of the boy king, in a spectacularly ill-judged attempt to curry favor with Caesar, had Pompey assassinated the moment he stepped ashore and presented his head to Caesar as a welcome gift. Caesar was reportedly horrified, not because he loved Pompey, he absolutely did not, but because it was a gross insult to Roman dignity. Only a Roman could kill a Roman of that stature. These provincial upstarts had overstepped. Annoyed, and probably a bit intrigued by the mess he'd stumbled into, Caesar decided to stick around. He set himself up in the royal palace, declared himself the arbiter of the succession crisis, and summoned both Cleopatra and her brother to plead their cases. This is where Cleopatra makes her legendary move, smuggling herself into the palace wrapped in a rug or a laundry bag, depending on the source, to get a private audience with Caesar. She was smart. She was charming. She spoke multiple languages, and she completely won him over. Caesar, a man with a well-documented weakness for powerful women and political opportunities, sided with Cleopatra. This did not go over well with the boy king's faction or the people of Alexandria. They saw Caesar, with his small legion of Roman soldiers, as an arrogant foreign occupier who was taking sides in their civil war. The royal army, loyal to Ptolemy XIII, besieged Caesar in the palace district of the city. He was trapped, cut off, and massively outnumbered. And this is where we get our fire. Caesar, a military genius but not a man known for his delicate touch, found himself in a desperate tactical situation. The enemy's fleet controlled the harbor, threatening to cut off his escape route and land more troops. So, he did what any cornered Roman general would do. He ordered his men to burn the ships in the dockyards. It was a sound military decision. Burn the enemy's fleet, and you'll remove a major threat. The problem was that fire, especially when fueled by wooden ships, tar, and a strong sea breeze, is not particularly good at following orders. The flames leaped from the ships to the docks, and from the docks to the warehouses and buildings that lined the waterfront. A huge section of the harbor district went up in smoke. So, did Caesar burn the Great Library of Alexandria? The short, boring, and most accurate answer is no. The Mausian complex, where the main library was located, was in the Bruchion, the royal quarter, set back a good distance from the harbor. It's highly unlikely that this fire, chaotic as it was, spread that far inland and managed to destroy that specific, massive stone complex while leaving the rest of the quarter intact. So what did burn? The most plausible theory is that what burned were warehouses near the port, but these weren't just any warehouses. Given the library's obsessive acquisition policy, It's very likely that these buildings were being used for storing scrolls. They could have been holding new acquisitions waiting to be catalogued, copies intended for export, or simply overflow from the main shelves. The Roman philosopher Seneca, writing a century later, claims that 40,000 scrolls were destroyed in the fire Caesar started. Now, 40,000 scrolls is a staggering loss. That's a library bigger than almost any other in the ancient world. It was a cultural catastrophe. But it wasn't the Great Library. It was an accidental, collateral damage burning of a storage annex. It was a wound. A terrible one, but not a mortal one. The heart of the institution, the main collection, and the scholarly community within the Mausean survived. The dream was singed, but it wasn't extinguished. The proof of this lies in what happened next. After Caesar won the Alexandrian War and installed Cleopatra firmly on the throne, the library continued to operate. In fact, there's a story that, years later, when Mark Antony, another Roman general with a thing for Cleopatra, wanted to give her a truly lavish gift, he didn't give her jewels or gold. He supposedly gave her the entire library of Pergamum, Alexandria's greatest rival, which held a collection of some 200,000 scrolls. He had it shipped to Alexandria to help replenish the stocks that had been lost. Historians debate whether this grand gesture actually happened, but the story itself tells us something important. Even decades after Caesar's fire, the Library of Alexandria was still considered the most prestigious intellectual institution in the world, a place worthy of receiving such a massive and culturally significant gift. You don't donate 200,000 books to a pile of ashes. You donate them to a living, breathing library. The famous burning of the library by Caesar was a tragic accident, a brutal amputation of a limb, but the body itself lived on, now patched up and restocked by yet another Roman suitor. The real end, when it came, would be much less dramatic and far more drawn out. It would be a slow fade, not a sudden blaze. So, the Roman soap opera has concluded. Antony and Cleopatra have made their dramatic exit at the Battle of Actium, choosing suicide over being paraded in chains through the streets of Rome, and with them, the entire Ptolemaic dynasty. 3 centuries of flamboyant, dysfunctional, and often brilliant rule comes to a quiet and rather sad end. In 30 BC, Egypt officially becomes a province of the Roman Empire. Not just any province, but the personal property of the new Emperor Octavian, soon to be known as Augustus. This is a fundamental shift in the management. The Ptolemies, for all their faults, were personally invested in the library. It was their family's crown jewel, a symbol of their Greek heritage and intellectual superiority. They poured money into it because it was a passion project, a monument to their own prestige. The Romans, on the other hand, were deeply pragmatic. They were the universe's most efficient and unsentimental accountants. Augustus appreciated culture, sure, but he appreciated a balanced budget and a steady supply of Egyptian grain even more. Under Roman rule, the firehouse of royal funding that had built the library was turned down to a trickle. The institution was maintained. Of course, it was still a famous landmark, a useful university for training the sons of the Roman elite, and a symbol of the great civilization Rome had absorbed. But the unconditional, lavish support was gone. There were no more agents scouring the world for scrolls with a blank check from the king. There was no more mass confiscation of books from ships. The era of obsessive world-beating acquisition was definitively over. The library was now living on a fixed income, like a retired celebrity subsisting on royalties. The focus of the scholarship shifted as well. The wild blue sky research of the early days, calculating the circumference of the earth, dissecting human bodies for the first time, was a thing of the past. The Roman era was one of consolidation, of commentary, of teaching. The library became less of a laboratory and more of a university. It produced excellent scholars, but they were mostly grammarians, literary critics, and philosophers who wrote commentaries on the great works that were already on their shelves. They were caretakers of a glorious past, not pioneers of a new future. And then there was the issue of competition. Pax Romana, the great Roman peace that settled over the Mediterranean, made travel and communication easier than ever before. The scholars that Ptolemy VIII, Physcon, had so violently scattered a century earlier had planted seeds of learning all over the Greek-speaking world. Now, under Roman rule, those seeds had grown. Athens had a major intellectual revival. New centers of learning popped up in other cities. Rome itself was becoming a cultural capital. A young, ambitious scholar no longer had to go to Alexandria. It was still the best place, probably. But it was no longer the only game in town. The library's monopoly on genius was broken. For the next couple of centuries, the library and the Mausian just sort of coast along. They coast on their reputation. They're still there. Scholars are still working, and students are still studying. The scrolls are still on their shelves, but the institution is slowly, imperceptibly, hollowing out. It's like a grand old family estate after the money runs out. The roof is still there, but it's starting to leak, and no one has the funds for a major repair. This slow decline was punctuated by moments of actual violence, but not the kind that makes for a good, simple story. These were the messy, brutal realities of being part of a massive empire. Fast forward to 215 AD, and we meet the Emperor Caracalla. Caracalla was, to put it mildly, an unpleasant man. He was a brutish soldier emperor, deeply insecure and prone to fits of murderous rage. He was on a tour of the eastern provinces, and he decided to visit Alexandria. The Alexandrians had a long-standing reputation for being smart, cultured, and incredibly sarcastic. They were famous for their sharp-witted political satire. And when they got a look at Caracalla, a man who had murdered his own brother to secure the throne, they did what they always did. They made jokes. They put on satirical plays, mocking his claims to be the new Alexander the Great. They made fun of his insecurity, his cruelty, and his parentage. It was just another day of edgy comedy in the big city. Caracalla did not have a sense of humor. He entered the city, pretending to be honored by their welcome. He even made a visit to the Mausian, engaging the scholars in learned discussions. Then, once he had lulled the city into a false sense of security, he unleashed his soldiers. He ordered a general massacre of the city's young men, the very demographic he blamed for the insults. Thousands were slaughtered in the streets, and as part of his punishment, he turned on the source of the city's intellectual arrogance. He abolished the scholars' stipends, confiscated their property, and expelled all foreign scholars from the city. He effectively shut down the Mausian. He gutted the institution, ending the centuries-old tradition of state-sponsored scholarship. The community that had been the living heart of the library was disbanded. This was another devastating blow. While the books might have remained, the community of minds that gave them meaning was once again broken and scattered. The state-sanctioned social club for geniuses was officially over. From now on, anyone who wanted to study in Alexandria had to pay their own way. The institution likely recovered in some diminished form, but the pattern was set. The fate of the library was no longer determined by scholarly pursuits, but by the random violence and political instability of the wider Roman world. It was no longer a protected sanctuary. It was just another building in a city that was becoming an increasingly frequent battleground. The final blows wouldn't come from a single fire, but from a whole series of messy, chaotic urban conflicts that would tear the city, and the library with it, apart. All right, let's settle back in. So our grand old library is in a pretty sorry state. The Golden Age is a distant memory. The royal patronage has dried up. The scholarly community has been gutted by a paranoid emperor. It's no longer the vibrant heart of the intellectual world, but more like a stately, neglected monument, a relic of a bygone era. It's still there, but it's fragile, waiting for the next tremor to shake its foundations. And a tremor is exactly what it's about to get. A whole century of them. In fact, we now drift into the 3rd century, a period historians have elegantly named the crisis of the 3rd century. It's a bit of an understatement. This was a 50-year period where the Roman Empire basically had a complete nervous breakdown. It was racked by constant civil wars, breakaway empires, barbarian invasions, plague, and economic collapse. Life was nasty, brutish, and short. And emperors had the life expectancy of Alexandria, the great port city and breadbasket of the empire, was right in the thick of it. It was too rich and too strategic to be left alone. It became a prize to be fought over by aspiring emperors and rebel queens. And this brings us to one of the most significant, yet least talked about, moments of destruction. It happened around the year 272 AD. At this time, a large chunk of the Eastern Roman Empire had broken away to form the Palmyrene Empire, ruled by the formidable Queen Zenobia. She was a brilliant, ambitious ruler who conquered Egypt and declared herself its queen, directly challenging Rome. The reigning Roman emperor, a tough-as-nails general named Aurelian, was not amused. He marched his armies east to put this rebellion down. His campaign led him, inevitably, to Alexandria, which was held by Zenobia's forces. Aurelian laid siege to the city. What followed wasn't a neat, contained battle out in some field. It was brutal, house-to-house urban warfare. And where did the heaviest fighting take place? In the Bruchion, the old royal quarter, the very district that housed the palaces, the temples, and the Mauseon with its great library. Contemporary accounts describe the district being completely devastated. Aurelian's forces fought their way through the city, street by street, leaving a trail of ruin. One writer lamented that the walls of the Bruchion were so thoroughly destroyed that a man could walk over the rubble without realizing a wall had ever been there. This, right here, is very likely the unspectacular, messy end of the main library. There was no single, dramatic fire ordered by a villain. There was just the grinding, indiscriminate destruction of war. The stone buildings were battered into rubble. The scrolls, inside hundreds of thousands of them, were likely scattered. Dustindir trampled into the mud, looted for their wooden spindles, or simply left to rot in the ruins of the collapsed buildings. Whatever survived, the initial assault, would have been exposed to the elements, ensuring its eventual decay. After Aurelian retook the city, he supposedly offered to spare the life of the remaining chief scholar, but the rest of the community was shattered. The Bruchion district never recovered its former glory. It was a wasteland, and the Great Library, the original institution founded by Ptolemy I, almost certainly died with it. It didn't go out with a bang. It was crushed under the weight of an empire tearing itself apart. It was a casualty of a forgotten battle in a long and bloody civil war. But hold on. The story doesn't quite end there, because Alexandria had a backup. Remember that from the early days, the Ptolemies had been building all over the city, sometime during their reign, probably under Ptolemy III. A second, daughter library was established. It was housed in the Serapeum, a magnificent temple complex dedicated to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapeum, located in a different, more populous part of the city called Rakotis. The Serapeum was a major religious and cultural center in its own right, and its library was no small affair. While it probably never rivaled the size of the main library in its golden age, some sources suggest it held tens of thousands of scrolls. It was a serious, significant collection. When scholars and writers after the 270s talk about the library in Alexandria, they are almost certainly talking about this one. The collection at it was the sole survivor, the inheritor of the great legacy. So the dream of universal knowledge wasn't entirely dead. It had just downsized and moved to a new neighborhood. But this new neighborhood came with its own set of problems. The Serapeum wasn't a secular, state-funded research center like the Mauseon. It was a pagan temple. And in the late Roman Empire, being a pagan temple was becoming an increasingly dangerous line of work. A new force was rising, a religion that was gaining followers and power with astonishing speed, a religion with its own book, its own fervent believers, and very little patience for the old gods and their temples, full of heathen literature. The final chapter of our story isn't about the clash of armies, but the clash of faiths. The surviving remnant of the great universal library now found itself on the front line of a cultural war between paganism and Christianity, and that was a war it could not possibly win. All right, let's pick up the threads from our slightly battered, but still extant, library in the Serapeum. It's managed to survive the Ptolemaican Sistan Fest, the pot-bellied tyrant's Purge, and even Caesar's accidental bonfire and Aurelian's devastating siege. This thing has 9 lives, apparently, but now it faces a new kind of threat, one that's less about Roman politics and more about religious zealotry. The stage is set for the final and most lamentable chapter in its long, slow demise. We're in the late 4th century AD. The Roman Empire is now officially Christian. Emperor Theodosius I has made Nicene Christianity the state religion, and he's not doing it subtly. He's issuing edicts against pagan worship, closing temples, and generally making life very uncomfortable for anyone still clinging to the old gods. And our Serapeum, remember, is a grand pagan temple dedicated to Serapis, complete with a massive library full of decidedly non-Christian texts. This is a recipe for trouble. In 391 AD, the city of Alexandria was gripped by intense religious fervor, which, as often happens, quickly devolved into outright violence. The Christian patriarch of Alexandria at the time was a man named He was an incredibly powerful, influential, and utterly ruthless figure. Theophilus, eager to consolidate Christian dominance and stamp out paganism, decided to take direct action. He obtained an imperial rescript, basically a decree from the emperor, authorizing him to convert a deserted temple of Dionysus into a church. But Theophilus, being Theophilus, didn't stop there. He used this as a pretext to demolish all pagan temples in Alexandria, or convert them into churches. And at the top of his hit list was the Serapeum. The Serapeum was more than just a temple. It was a fortress, a monumental complex, almost a city within a city. It was the last great stronghold of public pagan worship in Alexandria, a dazzling architectural marvel that housed the enormous statue of Serapis himself, a statue so grand that people believed if it were ever destroyed, the heavens would fall. And, of course, it housed the daughter library. When Theophilus's forces, a mob of monks and Christian zealots, began their assault on the Serapeum, the pagans within fortified themselves. This wasn't a quiet defense, it was a siege. The pagans, probably including many of the scholars and philosophers who still worked in the library, fought back desperately. There were skirmishes in the streets, and blood was shed. Theophilus's men broke into the temple, destroyed the statue of Serapis, and thankfully, the sky did not fall, and then proceeded to ransack the entire complex. Now, here's where the story gets a little hazy, and the slow, quiet truth gets muddied by later, more dramatic maniacans, especially those written by later Christian historians, either don't mention the library at all, or claim that it was already empty, or that the pagans had hidden the books away. This is, of course, a convenient narrative for those who don't want to admit to the destruction of cultural heritage by their own side, but it's far more likely, given the context, that the library was destroyed during this rampage. Imagine a frenzied mob of religious zealots, convinced they are doing God's work by eradicating pagan idolatry. Do you really think they're going to carefully sift through scrolls of Greek philosophy and science, gently placing them aside while they smash statues and pull down columns? No. They're going to see them as instruments of paganism, as dangerous, blasphemous texts, and they're going to burn them, tear them up, or simply scatter them to the winds as they lay waste to the entire complex. This wasn't a single, precise act of targeted book burning, like something out of a modern totalitarian regime. It was the chaotic, brutal, and often senseless destruction that comes with a religious riot. The Serapeum was razed to the ground, its magnificent buildings torn down, its statues smashed, and its treasures plundered. It's almost impossible to believe that a library, even one somewhat neglected, could survive such an event intact. So, while we can't point to a specific burn the books order, the destruction of the Serapeum in 391 AD effectively marked the end of the last significant public collection that bore the torch of the Great Library. And yet, some sparks of intellectual life flickered on. Alexandria, despite all this, remained a major intellectual center. Private collections of books still existed. Christian scholars were now prominent, and they had their own libraries. But the grand, universal, state-supported pagan institution of learning was gone. The final nail in the coffin, the one often cited in popular histories, occurred much later, in the 7th century. This is when the Arab armies conquered Egypt in 642 AD. Legend has it that when the Arab general Amir ibn as asked his caliph, Omar, what to do with the Library of Alexandria, Omar famously replied, "If these books are in agreement with the Quran, they are superfluous and need not be preserved. If they are at variance with the Quran, they are to be destroyed." And so, the story goes, The remaining books were used to fuel the public baths of Alexandria for 6 months. It's a wonderfully dramatic, decisive story, isn't it? A clear villain, a clear act of destruction, the perfect tidy ending to a tragic tale. The problem? It's almost certainly not true. This story doesn't appear in any historical sources for at least 500 years after the event. Arab historians themselves cast serious doubt on its veracity. By the 7th century, after centuries of decline, neglect, war, and religious strife, there was almost certainly no great library left to burn. The Serapeum had been destroyed centuries earlier. The main library in the Bruchion was gone, even before that. Any surviving books would have been scattered in smaller, private collections. What the Caliph Omar's story does is serve as a powerful cautionary tale about cultural destruction, even if it's largely apocryphal for Alexandria. It assigns a clear, single blame for a process that was actually long, slow, and messy. A death by 1,000 cuts rather than a single beheading. So, the Great Library of Alexandria didn't perish in a single cataclysmic blaze. It didn't fall victim to one evil tyrant. Either the slow, complicated death, a drawn-out process of decay that began with political purges, continued with accidental collateral damage from war, suffered from neglect and reduced funding, and finally succumbed to the religious intolerance and urban warfare of a fading empire. It was a victim of human fallibility in all its forms: ego, paranoia, pragmatism, and that, my friends, is the real tragedy of the library. Not a dramatic inferno, but a gradual fading into obscurity. A long, quiet unraveling of the most ambitious intellectual project in ancient history. Go ahead and mull that over as you drift off. And so, the dream of Alexandria fades, not in a glorious blaze, but in a slow, tired sigh. Like a story whispered so many times, it eventually just wears itself out. It's a sad little lesson in entropy. A story of how a great and noble idea can be slowly, methodically dismantled by generations of messy, flawed people. Speaking of messy, flawed people, let's just let the dust settle over the ruins of the Let's float away from the shores of Egypt, leaving behind the ghosts of scholars and the scent of burnt papyrus. Let's drift across the Mediterranean and quite a few centuries forward in time to a place where the air is thick with incense, perfume, and the quiet, creeping dread of genetic collapse. Because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that when you mix absolute power with a very, very small gene pool, you get some truly spectacular human disasters. Tonight, we're going to wade into those murky waters. We're going to explore the world of royal inbreeding, a practice born of arrogance, political necessity, and a frankly stunning lack of concern for basic biology. And there is no better place to start than with the family that turned generational inbreeding from a bad habit into a state policy. A family whose name became synonymous with a protruding lower jaw and a host of other unfortunate physical traits. We are, of course, talking about the Habsburgs. For centuries, the House of Habsburg was one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. Through a series of very clever marriages, their motto was, "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." They managed to acquire a sprawling empire that at its height included Spain, the Netherlands, large parts of Italy, the Holy Roman Empire, and a massive colonial empire in the Americas. They were, for a time, the masters of the world. But there was a catch. Once you've acquired all that land through marriage, how do you keep it in the family? Well, the Habsburg solution was simple. Just keep marrying each other. Uncles married nieces. First cousins married first cousins. It was a closed loop, a dynasty folding in on itself over and over again. They were trying to consolidate power, to keep their vast territories from being divided. But what they were actually consolidating was a collection of unfortunate, recessive genes. This brings us to the famous Habsburg Jaw, officially known as mandibular prognathism. It's a condition where the lower jaw grows so much larger than the upper jaw that the teeth don't line up. It makes chewing difficult, talking a chore, and gives the face a distinct, bulldog-like appearance. It was often accompanied by a thick, drooping lower lip and a long nose. This wasn't just a coincidence. It was a dominant family trait, amplified by generations of inbreeding until it became the unmistakable stamp of the dynasty. They were so proud of it, in a weird way. It was a sign you were a true Habsburg, even if it meant you couldn't properly eat a sandwich. But the jaw was just the most visible of their problems. The same genetic lottery that gave them their distinctive looks also blessed them with a host of other issues. Epilepsy, gout, dropsy, depression, and a high rate of infant mortality. They were a sad, sickly bunch, living lives of immense privilege, but often in constant physical pain and mental anguish. And at the very end of this long, sad genetic road, we find our poster boy for the whole disastrous experiment. The grand finale of 2 centuries of Habsburgs marrying Habsburgs. A king so profoundly, tragically inbred that he serves as the ultimate cautionary tale. Let's travel to late 17th century Spain and meet King Charles II. Even before he was born, the expectations were not great. His father, Philip IV of Spain, was also his mother's uncle. That's right! Philip IV married his sister's daughter, Mariana of Austria. This made Charles's mother his aunt and his cousin, and his father his uncle and his great. If you tried to draw their family tree, it would look less like a tree and more like a wreath. Genetically speaking, Charles was more inbred than a child of a brother-sister union. His coefficient of inbreeding was a staggering 25%, a number that geneticists usually only see in controlled lab experiments with animals. From the moment of his birth in 1661, it was clear that something was very wrong. He was a weak, sickly baby, prone to constant fevers and illnesses. He didn't speak until he was 4. He couldn't walk until he was 8. His head was enormous, but his limbs were frail. And of course, he had the Habsburg Jaw in its most extreme form. His lower jaw jutted out so far that his 2 rows of teeth didn't meet at all. He couldn't chew his food, so he had to swallow his meals practically whole, leading to constant indigestion and stomach ailments. His tongue was reportedly so large that he drooled constantly, and his speech was thick and almost unintelligible. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched or the hexed, because the common people, and even many at court, couldn't believe that a human being could be so afflicted by natural causes. It had to be the work of witchcraft, a curse placed upon the royal line. The truth, of course, was far more mundane and far more tragic. The curse wasn't from a witch. It was written in his own DNA. He was, by all accounts, a gentle and kind-hearted soul, but his intellectual development was severely stunted. He was barely educated, partly because his tutors feared that putting any strain on his fragile mind might kill him. He spent most of his childhood being treated like a delicate porcelain doll, an object of state to be preserved at all costs, but not a person to be nurtured or taught. His main pastimes were playing with his dwarves and listening to stories. Yet this profoundly disabled man was the absolute monarch of the vast Spanish Empire, an empire that spanned the globe. The fate of millions rested on the shoulders of a man who struggled to chew his own food. It was a situation that was as absurd as it was tragic, and the rest of Europe watched, waited, and plotted, knowing that this last flickering flame of the Spanish Habsburg line could not possibly produce an heir. His life was not just a personal tragedy, it was a geopolitical time bomb, ticking slowly toward a massive, continent-spanning war of succession. And all anyone could do was watch him slowly, painfully, live out his sad, bewitched life. So, Charles II, King of Spain and the Indies, Duke of Milan, Sovereign of the Netherlands, and a man whose own body was a prison built by the choices of his ancestors. He was the living, breathing, drooling embodiment of a dynasty that had literally run out of road, a genetic dead end sitting on one of the most powerful thrones in the world. So how does an empire function with a king like this at its head? The short answer is eat barelli do. Charles was king in name only. The real power lay with whoever could control him. For the early part of his reign, that person was his mother, the formidable Mariana of Austria. She was a woman who had been imported to be a broodmare and ended up as the regent of Spain, a grim, severe figure who ran the kingdom with an iron will, jealously guarding her son from any rival influences. Of course, with the power vacuum at the center of the Spanish Empire, the court became a delightful little ecosystem of schemers, sycophants, and rival factions, all circling the weak king like vultures waiting for a sick buffalo to finally keel over. His dashing, illegitimate half-brother, Don Juan José of Austria, managed to seize power for a brief time, but the court was a revolving door of favorites and ministers, all while the ship of state slowly rusted at its moor. But the real drama, the central, all-consuming obsession of Charles's entire reign, was the succession. Everyone knew he was sickly. Everyone looked at him and thought, there is no way this man produces an heir. The entire political future of Europe hung on this one, deeply personal and ultimately impossible question. And so, they tried. Oh, how they tried. The first attempt came in the form of a young, beautiful, and lively French princess, Marie-Louise d'. She was the niece of the Sun King, Louis XIV of France. She was brought to the gloomy, hyper-formal Spanish court in 1679 to be Charles's queen. It was, from the start, a recipe for misery. The Spanish court was a place of crushing etiquette, where a queen was not allowed to look out a window or laugh too loudly. For a vibrant young woman from the glittering court of Versailles, it was like being buried alive. And her one job, her entire reason for being, was to produce a Habsburg heir with a man who was, for all intents and purposes, an overgrown, impotent infant. The pressure on her was immense. Every month that passed without a pregnancy was a national crisis. The court whispered. The ambassadors wrote frantic letters home. Marie-Louise reportedly grew deeply depressed, finding solace in food and horseback riding. She and Charles, in their own strange way, seemed to develop a genuine affection for each other. He was kind to her, and she treated him with a gentleness he had rarely known. But affection doesn't create heirs. After a decade of this hopeless, soul-crushing existence, Marie-Louise died suddenly at the age of 26, possibly from appendicitis, though the court, of course, buzzed with rumors of poison. The Spanish court didn't even wait for her body to get cold. The need for an heir was too desperate, so they imported another one. This time, it was a German princess, Maria Anna of New. She was chosen specifically because her family was famously fertile. Her mother had given birth to 23 children. If anyone could squeeze an heir out of Charles, the thinking went, it was a woman with these genes. Poor Maria Anna. She arrived to find the same gloomy court, the same impossible task, and a husband who was now older and even more decrepit. She was ambitious and tough, and quickly became a major player in the court's political games. But her primary mission was a complete failure. There were a few phantom pregnancies, announced with great fanfare and then quietly forgotten, but it was no use. The king was incapable. As the years dragged on and Charles's health continued to decline, the court's desperation curdled into something much weirder. The theory that he was bewitched gained more and more traction. If medicine couldn't fix him, maybe something else could. The king himself, a deeply pious man, came to believe it. He was convinced that his impotence and illnesses were the result of a demonic curse. And so began one of the most bizarre and pathetic episodes in royal history. The exorcisms of Charles II. Priests and exorcists were brought to the palace. The king of the Spanish Empire was subjected to endless rituals. They prayed over him, they made him drink holy water, they had him wear relics. The inquisitors got involved, launching investigations to find the sorcerer who had supposedly cursed him. They questioned everyone. They even, in a moment of peak absurdity, had the bodies of his ancestors exhumed so that the king could touch their coffins, hoping the lingering royal essence might shock his system back into working order. Imagine the scene. A pale, trembling king, his famous jaw hanging slack, being led through the royal crypt, the air thick with the dust of centuries, forced to confront the decaying remains of the very people whose choices had led him to this state. It wasn't just a medical tragedy or a political crisis anymore. It had become a full-blown Gothic horror show, a sad, grotesque circus of superstition and despair, all centered on the failing body of this one unfortunate man. But no amount of prayer or holy water could rewrite his genetic code. The curse was real, but it wasn't demonic. And with every failed exorcism, the vultures of Europe circled lower, sharpening their talons for the feast to come. So the exorcists have packed up their bells and holy water The chanting has faded, and King Charles II of Spain is still bewitched, still broken, and now he's dying. The last decade of the 17th century was just a long, slow, public waiting game. Everyone in Europe knew the king's health was failing, and the question of who would inherit his vast, globe-spanning empire became the only political topic that mattered. The court, in Madrid, turned into a snake pit. On one side, you had the Austrian faction, led by the Queen herself, Maria Anna of Neuburg. She was, quite reasonably, lobbying for the empire to pass to her nephew, Archduke Charles of Austria. He was a Habsburg. After all, it would keep the dynasty, or at least the family name, in charge. It felt like the natural, proper order of things. On the other side, you had the French faction, led by the powerful Cardinal. They argued that the only power in Europe strong enough to hold the massive Spanish Empire together and defend it from being carved up by rivals was France. They pushed for the inheritance to go to Philip, Duke of Anjou, who was the grandson of the most powerful monarch in Europe, Louis XIV. And Louis XIV, let's not forget, had both a Habsburg mother and a Habsburg wife, giving him a very strong claim. And caught in the middle of this grim tug-of-war was Charles, a man who could barely make a decision about what to have for dinner, was now tasked with deciding the fate of the world. The pressure was immense. Ambassadors whispered in his ear. Ministers presented him with endless documents. His wife and his cardinal pulled him in opposite directions. For a man who had spent his life shielded from responsibility, it was a waking nightmare. In his final months, as his body began to completely shut down, Charles seems to have achieved a moment of strange, lucid clarity. He understood one thing above all else. He was the King of Spain, and his final duty was to preserve the Spanish Empire intact. He did not want to see it partitioned, broken up and handed out like party favors to the squabbling royal houses of Europe. He wanted it to survive, whole and undivided. He looked at the two options. The Austrian Habsburgs were his family, yes, but they were the junior branch, a diminished power. Could they really defend Spain and its colonies from the ambitions of the French, the English, and the Dutch? Maybe not, but France, under the Sun King, was the undisputed superpower of the age. If anyone had the military might and the political will to take on the whole Spanish inheritance and keep it together, it was Louis XIV. And so, in the fall of 1700, with what little strength he had left, Charles made his decision. He signed a new will. In it, he disinherited the Austrian side of his family completely. He bequeathed the entire, undivided Spanish Empire Spain, the Netherlands, Milan, Naples, Sicily, and all the vast territories in the Americas, and the Philippines too. Philippi and Jew, the French claimant. There was one condition. Philip had to renounce any claim to the French throne for himself and his descendants. The two kingdoms could never be united under a single ruler. It was a last, desperate attempt to hand his empire over to a guardian strong enough to protect it, without creating a single, continent-swallowing superstate. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II finally died. He was just 38 years old. The aftermath was immediate and chilling. An autopsy was performed, and the report is one of the most horrifying medical documents ever produced. The physicians who opened him up were stunned. They found a king whose body had seemingly rotted from the inside out while he was still alive. His heart, they wrote, was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corrupt. His intestines were gangrenous. His head was full of water. He had only a single testicle, black as coal. It was the final, gruesome evidence of a genetic train wreck. The Bewitched King hadn't been cursed by a demon. He had been poisoned, slowly and systematically, by his own bloodline. When the will was read, the court was stunned into silence. Then, chaos. Louis XIV received the news in Versailles. He walked into a hall full of courtiers with his grandson Philip and declared, "Gentlemen, you see before you the King of Spain." It was a moment of supreme triumph. He had won the ultimate prize without firing a single shot. A popular, though probably made-up, quote, attributed to the sun. King summed it all up. Il n'est applause Pyrenees. There are no more Pyrenees. The mountain range that had separated France and Spain for centuries had been erased by the stroke of a pen. The rest of Europe, particularly England, the Netherlands, and the Austrian Empire, looked at this new Bourbon megablock with absolute terror. They saw a future dominated by a single, all-powerful family. It was an unacceptable disruption of the balance of power. And so, their reaction was swift and predictable. They formed a grand alliance, declared the will of Charles II invalid, and proclaimed the Austrian claimant, Archduke Charles, as the rightful King Charles III of Spain. And so began the War of the Spanish Succession, a war that would last for over a decade, a war that would be fought on land and sea, in Spain, Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands, a war that would involve all the major powers of Europe and kill hundreds of thousands of people. All of it, the entire bloody, continent-spanning conflict, was the direct result of 2 centuries of Habsburgs marrying their nieces, the personal, genetic tragedy of one sad, bewitched king had exploded into a global political catastrophe. The dynasty's obsessive effort to keep its lands together by folding in on itself had ultimately resulted in it losing its most prized kingdom in the most violent way imaginable. It was the final, bitter, and exquisitely ironic punchline to a very, very long and very, very bad family joke. So, the Spanish Habsburgs have spectacularly imploded, leaving behind a continent at war and a very memorable autopsy report. Their story serves as a perfect, grim little fable about what happens when you treat a family tree like a Mobius strip. The dynasty, however, wasn't entirely extinguished. It was like a great, rotting tree whose Spanish branch had fallen off in a storm. The original trunk, the Austrian Habsburgs, still stood, ruling over a vast and increasingly fragile empire in the heart of Europe. Let's just let the smoke clear over the battlefields of the War of the Spanish Succession and float forward in time past the age of powdered wigs and revolutions, all the way to the 19th century. We're going to land in Vienna, the glittering capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a city of waltzes, coffee houses, and magnificent palaces, and at the heart of it all, we find our next Habsburg, a man who was the polar opposite of the unfortunate Charles II. He was disciplined, hard-working, and tragically dutiful, and in his own way, his story is just as sad. Meet Emperor Franz Joseph I. He came to the throne in 1848, a year of revolutions that swept across Europe. From the very beginning, his reign was defined by duty, discipline, and the desperate effort to hold his creaking, multi-ethnic empire together. He was the quintessential monarch husband. He woke up at 4 a.m. every morning, spent his days buried in state paperwork, ate simple meals, and wore the uniform of an army officer. He saw himself not as a divine ruler, but as the first servant of the state. His personal feelings, his own happiness, were completely irrelevant. The empire was all that mattered. Now, a man this rigid, this emotionally buttoned up, needs a wife. Not for love, of course, but for the same old reason, to produce an heir and an heir. His domineering mother, the Archduchess Sophia, called the only man at court, had it all arranged. Franz Joseph was to marry his first cousin, a well-behaved and suitable German princess named Helene. In the summer of 1853, Helene and her family traveled to the imperial resort of Bad Ischl for the formal engagement. But Helene didn't come alone. She brought along her younger sister, a shy, awkward, and breathtakingly beautiful 16-year-old girl named Elizabeth. Everyone called her Sisi. The story goes that when the 23-year-old emperor walked into the room to greet his intended bride, he simply couldn't take his eyes off her little sister. Helene was dressed in a formal, somber dress, prepared for the gravity of the occasion. Sisi was wearing a simple rose-colored dress, looking youthful and carefree. The emperor was instantly smitten. In a rare act of personal rebellion, he defied his powerful mother and declared that he would marry Sisi and no one else. It sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it? The powerful emperor, captivated by the innocent young duchess, choosing love over dynastic arrangement. But this is the Habsburgs we're talking about. Fairy tales have a tendency to curdle. Sisi was not prepared for this. She had grown up in the relaxed, informal countryside of Bavaria, where she spent her days riding horses, writing poetry, and enjoying a freedom that was completely unheard of in the rigid Spanish court protocol that still governed Vienna. She was a free spirit, and she was about to be locked in a gilded cage. From the moment she arrived in Vienna as the new empress, she was miserable. The court was a viper's nest of gossip and criticism, led by her own mother-in-law who took it upon herself to mold this stupid little goose into a proper empress. Every aspect of Sissy's life was controlled: what she wore, what she ate, who she spoke to. When she gave birth to her first two daughters, they were immediately taken away from her to be raised by Sophie, because Sissy was deemed too young and flighty to be a proper mother. She was trapped by her duty, trapped by the suffocating etiquette, and trapped in a marriage to a man she barely knew. A man who loved her in his own quiet, dutiful way, but who could never understand her need for freedom and emotional expression. His answer to her unhappiness was to work harder, to be more disciplined. Her answer was to retreat further and further into herself. So she developed obsessions. Her most famous was with her own beauty. She was considered the most beautiful woman in the world, and she worked tirelessly to preserve that beauty because it was the one thing she felt she had control over. Her hair was magnificent, floor-length, and so heavy it gave her headaches. It took 3 hours every day just to wash and braid it. She followed bizarre, punishing diets sometimes consisting of nothing but the juice of raw beefsteaks to maintain her impossibly slender 19-inch waist. She would spend hours every day exercising in her private gym, a precursor to the modern fitness craze. Her beauty was her armor, but it was also another prison. She fled the court whenever she could, embarking on endless travels. She went to Hungary, a part of the empire she genuinely loved, and where she was adored. She went to Madeira, to Corfu, building a lavish palace she called the She went on strenuous mountain hikes and dangerous sea. She was constantly running, trying to escape a gilded cage that existed as much in her own mind as it did in the palaces of Vienna. She and Franz Joseph grew further and further apart, living essentially separate lives. He remained in Vienna, drowning in paperwork, the lonely, dutiful emperor. She became the vanishing empress, a restless, melancholic ghost haunting the courts of Europe. They did manage to produce the one thing the empire desperately needed: a male heir, a crown prince named Rudolph, and it was upon his shoulders that all the hopes, all the duty, and all the suffocating pressure of the Habsburg dynasty would now be placed. And if Sissi was a tragedy of quiet desperation, her son would be a tragedy of explosive, dramatic self-destruction.
Today we will talk about a very old history topic. This story is from a time when there were no house, no cities, no schools and no books. This is the story of fire. Fire is not just a thing but that burns. Fire changed everything. Fire made human different from animals. Without fire, there would be no food like today, no protection, no progress, and maybe no modern world. This is the story of how fire slowly changed human life step by step. Long, long ago, humans were very weak. They had no clothes, no proper homes, and no weapons. They lived in forest and open land. They were always afraid. Big animals hunted them, cold weather, hot there, dark nights scared them. Human ate raw food. Raw meat was hard to chew. Raw plants were bitter and dangerous. People got sick easily. Many people died young. Life was very hard. The first time humans saw fire. Yes, fire was not first made by human. Fire came from nature. Lighting heat trees, volcanoes burned land, dry forest caught fire. Early humans saw fire from far away. They saw bright light. They felt heat. At first, they were scared. Fire was dangerous. Fire burned skin. Fire destroyed trees. But humans are curious. They watched fire carefully. Slowly, humans understood something important. Fire is dangerous, but fire is also useful. Fire give heat, fire give light. People start keeping fire interested of running away. They carried burning wood from natural fire. They portrayed that fire carefully. If fire dead, life became hard again. Fire became like a friend. Fire and warmth. Cold weather was deadly before fire. Winter killed many people. People shivered at night. Fire changed this. Fire kept human warmth and people could live in a colder place. They could travel to new lands. Fire helped humans survive winter. This was a very big change in history. Fire and light. Before fire, night was very dark. Darkness brought fear. Wild animal hunted at night. Fire brought light. People could see at night. They could stay together. They could talk and think. This helped humans before social. This helped humans share idea. Fire created community. Fire and protection. Fire scared wild animal. Animal we are afraid of flame. They stayed away from fire. Humans used fire as protection. They slept near fire. This saved many lives. Fire became a side. Fire and cooked food. This was one of the biggest change in human history. Yes, human learned to cook food. Cooked meat was soft. Cooked plant were safe. People became stronger. Their brains grew bigger. Good food gave more energy. Scientists believe cooking helped human become intelligent. Fire helped create the human brain. Fire and tools. Fire helped humans make tools. They hardened wood in fire. They shaped stone using heat. Later, fire helped me melt metal. This lead to copper tools. They bronze tools. They iron tools. Fire started technology. Fire and caves. Human lived in caves. Caves were dark and cold. Fire made caves livable. Fire kept animal away. Fire gave light inside cave. Human painted on cave walls using firelight. This was early art. This was early culture. Fire and social life. Fire brought people together. People sat around fire. They talked. They shared stories. This was the beginning of language. This was the beginning of tradition. Fire created human society. Learned to make fire. At first, human protected natural fire. Later, they learned to make fire. They rubbed stones. They rubbed wood. This was a huge discovery. Now fire was always available. Human we are no longer dependent on nature. This was the freedom. Fire and migration. Fire allowed humans to move. They went to good lands. They crossed mountains. Fire helped humans spread across the world from Africa to Asia, from Asia to Europe, from Europe to everywhere. Fire helped humans conquering that plant. Fire and religion. Fire became scared. People believe fire was a magic. People worshipped fire. Yes, many religions used fire. Fire rituals started. Fire became a symbol of life. Fire and farming. Fire helped clear forest. People burned land. This made farming possible. Yes, farming changed human life. People settled down. Villages formed and cities were born. Are you know? Fast start civilization. Fire and industry. Thousands of years later, fire powered machine, fire boiled water, steam and gas were born. Factors started, trains moved, fire became energy. Fire and modern world. Today, fire still help us. Electric comes from fire. Cooking or users use fire. Industries uses fire, and fire still saves human life. Conclusion: fire is not just that the fire is the history. Fire made humans human. Without fire, there would be no civilization, no cities, no technology. Fast is the greatest discovery in human history. This, thank you. Today, now this is a very interesting story. I am feeling mm, very relaxed now because I am try to very best now to please subscribe, like, and comment. Thank you. Today we will talk about a very old history topic. This story is from a time when there were no house, no cities, no schools, and no books. This is the story of fire. Fire is not just a thing, but that burns. Fire changed everything. Fire made human different from animals. Without fire, there would be no food like today, no protection, no progress, and maybe no modern world. This is the story of how fire slowly changed human life step by step. Long ago, humans were very weak. They had no clothes, no proper homes, and no weapons. They lived in forest and open land. They were always afraid. Big animals hunted them, cold weather, hot there, dark nights scared them. Human ate raw food. Raw meat was hard to chew. Raw plants were bitter and dangerous. People got sick easily. Many people died young. Life was very hard. The first time humans saw fire. Yes, fire was not first made by human. Fire came from nature. Lighting heat trees, volcanoes burned land, dry forest caught fire. Early humans saw fire from far away. They saw bright light. They felt heat. At first, they were scared. Fire was dangerous. Fire burned skin. Fire destroyed trees. But humans are curious. They watched fire carefully. Slowly, humans understood something important. Fire is dangerous, but fire is also useful. Fire give heat, fire give light. People start keeping fire interested of running away. They carried burning wood from natural fire. They portrayed that fire carefully. If fire dead, life became hard again. Fire became like a friend. Fire and warmth. Cold weather was deadly before fire. Winter killed many people. People slept at night. Fire changed this. Fire kept human warmth and people could live in a colder place. They could travel to new lands. Fire helped humans survive winter. This was a very big change in history. Fire and light. Before fire, night was very dark. Darkness brought fear. Wild animal hunted at night. Fire brought light. People could see at night. They could stay together. They could talk and think. This helped humans before social. This helped humans share idea. Fire created community. Fire and protection. Fire scared wild animal we are afraid of flame. They stayed away from fire. Humans used fire as protection. They slept near fire. This saved many lives. Fire became a side. Fire and cooked food. This was one of the biggest change in human history. Yes, human learned to cook food. Cooked meat was soft. Cooked plant were safe. People became stronger. Their brains grew bigger. Good food gave more energy. Scientists believe cooking helped human become intelligent. Fire helped create the human brain. Fire and tools. Fire helped humans make tools. They hardened wood in fire. They shaped stone using heat. Later, fire helped me melt metal. This lead to copper tools. They bronze tools. They iron tools. Fire started technology. Fire and caves. Human lived in caves. Caves were dark and cold. Fire made caves livable. Fire kept animal away. Fire gave light inside cave. Human painted on cave walls using firelight. This was early art. This was early culture. Fire and social life. Fire brought people together. People sat around fire, they talked, they shared stories. This was the beginning of language, this was the beginning of tradition. Fire created human society, learned to make fire. At first, human protected natural fire. Later, they learned to make fire. They rubbed stones, they rubbed wood. This was a huge discovery. Now fire was always available. Human we are no longer dependent on nature. This was the freedom. Fire and migration. Fire allowed humans to move. They went to good lands. They crossed mountains. Fire helped humans spread across the world, from Africa to Asia, from Asia to Europe, from Europe to everywhere. Fire helped humans conquering that plant. Fire and religion. fire became scared. People believe fire was a magic. People worshipped fire. Yes, many religions used fire. Fire rituals started. Fire became a symbol of life. Fire and farming. Fire helped clear forest. People burned land. This made farming possible. Yes, farming changed human life. People settled down. Villages formed and cities were born. Are you know? Fast start civilization. Fire and industry. Thousands of years later, fire powered machine, fire boiled water, steam and